This week, the United States Electoral College officially voted to elect Joe Biden as the next U.S. president and Kamala Harris as the next U.S. vice president. The election of Harris, in particular, is a historic moment for the United States, as it is the first time that they have elected a woman to the role of vice president. Now, as most people know, Kamala Harris is also a person of color, which simply means that she is not white. In her case, she's biracial or mixed race. Her father is a Black Jamaican who immigrated to the U.S. in the 1960s, and her mother, who has since passed away, was originally from India. However, contrary to what many people assume, Kamala Harris will not be the first person of color to hold the position of vice president. Yes, she will be the first Black vice president, as well as the first person of South Asian descent. However, she will not be the first person of color in general. Although a lot of people aren't aware of this, the U.S. actually elected its first non-white vice president all the way back in 1928. In that year, the U.S. elected a man who was half white and half Native American. His name was Charles Curtis, and today I'm going to show you his family tree. At the same time, I'll be discussing quite a bit of U.S. history in general, and in particular, Native American history. Speaking of U.S. history, this video is part of yet another collaboration with fellow YouTuber Mr. Beat. So if U.S. history is your thing, be sure to check out his video after this one. You can find the link on screen at the end or in the description. I want to start by showing you a map of North America before the arrival of European settlers. Although it is often said that Christopher Columbus discovered America, this is obviously incorrect because when he landed, there were already millions of people living here. In Canada, we refer to the original inhabitants of our country as First Nations, but in the US, the term Native American is usually used. The first thing you need to know about Native Americans is that they were not and are not a single unified group of people. Just like there are many different types of Europeans, Asians, and Africans, there were, and still are, many different types of Native Americans. However, pre-Columbian North America was never organized into centralized nation-states or countries like in Europe. So the best way we have of discussing the various different Native American peoples is to rely first on broad linguistic categories, which are what the colors on this map represent, and then second on the individual tribes that existed, and in many cases still exist, within those categories. Now, the number of individual tribes actually numbers in the hundreds, so keep in mind that this map is by no means comprehensive. But let me point out a few of the major groups. At the time of first contact, there were three main language groups in the East. The largest by far, in terms of land area, were the Algonquin speakers. They lived along the northeast coast, as well as around the Great Lakes. Then there were the Iroquois speakers, who lived around what is now New York State, but who also included the Cherokee, who lived in the south, next to the third main group, the Muskogee speakers. The Muskogee speakers included the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. The white settlers later called these four groups, together with the Cherokee, the five civilized tribes, obviously a very loaded Eurocentric term. To the west, there were another three major language groups. The Siouan speakers, who lived on the plains, the Uto-Aztecan speakers, who lived in the Great Basin, and the Na-Dene speakers, who lived in and around what is today New Mexico, as well as up near Alaska. This language group includes the Navajo, who are currently the second largest Native American tribe today, after the Cherokee. Finally, along the Pacific coast, we get the greatest amount of linguistic diversity, with far too many independent language groups to show on this map. The reason why the West is more diverse than the East is likely due to the fact that, unlike the Europeans, who settled the continent from east to west, the original inhabitants of the continent settled it in the opposite direction, generally speaking, going from west to east. Okay, with that background, let's now turn our attention to Vice President Charles Curtis, who, like I said, was half Native American. In fact, he descends from 3 different Native American tribes: the Potawatomi, who are Algonquin-speaking, as well as the Kaw and Osage, both of whom are Siouan-speaking. Let's start with a man named Pawhuska, who was an Osage chief around the time that the United States declared independence. Of course, at that time, the U.S. was not as large as it is today. Its border basically ended at the Mississippi River. This means that the Osage lived outside of the U.S. at this point. However, shortly after American independence, a bunch of Native American tribes from both sides of the Mississippi formed a loose confederacy in order to fight against the U.S. In 1791, Pawhuska and several Osage warriors participated in the Battle of the Wabash, which took place in what is today Ohio and is more commonly known as St. Clair's Defeat, named after the U.S. General Arthur St. Clair. The battle was one of the worst military defeats ever in U.S. history, and definitely their worst ever defeat at the hands of Native Americans. There were almost 1,000 casualties on the American side, but very few on the Native side. According to one story, during the battle, Chief Pawhuska took a white wig off a fallen U.S. soldier and kept it as a trophy, hence his nickname Whitehair. At some point, Pawhuska's daughter, named Mina, married the chief of the nearby Kaw, or Kansa, tribe in order to cement an alliance. That chief's name was Nampawara, also known as White Plume. But within the lifetime of Mina and Nampawara, the Native American way of life changed forever. In 1803, the U.S. quote-unquote purchased a large portion of the continent from the French, known as the Louisiana Purchase. Of course, most of the land was not actually controlled by the French, but was rather inhabited by many different Native American groups, including the Kaw and the Osage. What followed was either outright conflict and/or forced treaties. Nampawara opted for the treaty option. Between 1803 and 1806, 2 men known as Lewis and Clark traveled from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean in order to survey the continent. In 1821, Clark, now holding the title Superintendent of Indian Affairs, brought a delegation of Native leaders to Washington to meet then-President James Monroe. Nampawara was one of the delegates, and several years later, he signed a treaty ceding his people's land to the U.S. Nampawara had 2 daughters, both of whom married men who were half French, half Native. One of these men was Joachim Sr., who worked as an interpreter for the U.S. government, as well as a guide for the famous Baptist missionary Isaac McCoy, who unfortunately was a proponent of a policy known as Indian removal. Basically, the U.S. government forced many Native American tribes, including the so-called 5 civilized tribes, to pick up and relocate further west to what is now the state of Oklahoma, but at the time was simply called Indian Territory. This forced migration became known as the Trail of Tears and is nowadays considered to have been an act of genocide, considering the fact that it directly resulted in the deaths of around 15,000 natives. The Potawatomi, Kaw, and Osage nations were also eventually resettled in Oklahoma, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Let's return to the 2 daughters of Nampawara. His other daughter, named Waihesi, married Louis Gonville, whose father was a French fur trader and whose mother was a member of the Potawatomi tribe. Together, Louis and Wahesi had a daughter named Julie, who then married Louis Papin, who, like Julie's father, was half French, half Potawatomi. Louis Papin and Julie Gonville were the parents of Ellen Papin, who married a man of British descent named Orrin Curtis. By this point, the U.S. was on the verge of civil war. The country now stretched from coast to coast, but much of the territory in the West was still unorganized. For example, the state of Kansas did not yet exist, but instead was called Kansas Territory. It was in Kansas Territory, on land that formerly belonged to the Kaw people, that the future Vice President Charles Curtis was born. When he was just 1 year old, two important things happened. First, Kansas became a state. And second, the new state of Kansas joined the side of the North in the U.S. Civil War. Charles's father, Orrin, fought in the war as a Union soldier and eventually achieved the rank of captain. Charles, of course, stayed at home with his mother, and therefore his first two languages were French and Kansa, not English. But then, in 1863, his mother died, and he ended up being raised by his maternal grandparents, Louis Papin and Julie Gonville, who lived on a Kaw reservation in Kansas. When he was 8 years old, a rival tribe attacked his reservation, and he escaped with Joe Jim Jr. to Topeka, the capital city of Kansas, where he became known as Indian Charlie. There, he lived with his paternal grandparents, William Curtis and Permelia Hubbard, and eventually became a lawyer. But he maintained his connection to his native roots. By this point, the Kaw people had been relocated to Oklahoma, and he registered himself as a member of the Kaw Nation there. But his home was in Topeka, and there he married a woman of European descent named Annie Baird, and had 3 children named Permelia, Harry, and Leona. His entry into politics began in 1893 when he was elected as a Republican congressman in the state of Kansas, and then later as a senator. During his time in Congress, he introduced a piece of legislation that went on to become known as the Curtis Act, named, of course, after him. The Curtis Act was an amendment to an earlier act known as the Dawes Act. The sad and ironic thing about these two acts is that they actually ended up being extremely destructive towards the identity, sovereignty, and cultures of Native Americans. Basically, they allowed the federal government to take away land occupied communally by Native tribes and instead assign it to individual Native Americans under a capitalist system. But it's important to note that while Charles Curtis wrote the original draft of the Curtis Act, the act went through many revisions and had many amendments added to it by the time it passed. Curtis himself said in his autobiography that he was unhappy with the final version. So I don't think it's fair to say, as some people have, that because of the Curtis Act, Curtis was some sort of traitor to his own people. Throughout his time in office, Curtis actually did a lot in terms of fighting for the rights of Native Americans, particularly those of Native American women. As I mentioned earlier, Curtis eventually went from being a member of the House of Representatives to being a senator. In fact, he went on to serve as both the Senate Majority Leader and the Senate's President pro tempore. In 1928, he ran for president, but lost the Republican nomination to Herbert Hoover. But he then became Hoover's running mate, and together they won the 1928 presidential election in a landslide. Thus, in 1929, Curtis became the first biracial individual to serve as Vice President of the United States. Curtis's wife, Annie, passed away before he became vice president. So interestingly, his half-sister, Dolly, often attended social events in the capacity usually filled by the Second Lady. In 1932, Curtis officially opened the Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. And then later the same year, Hoover and Curtis lost re-election in a major blowout to Democrats Franklin D. Roosevelt and John Garner. At that point, Curtis retired from politics, and 3 years later, he passed away at the age of 76. So that was a look at the first and only person of Native American descent to serve as Vice President of the United States. If you're in the mood for some more U.S. history, I encourage you to follow the link on screen to head over to Mr. Beat's channel. Thanks for watching.